It was 3:17 a.m. when I woke up for no apparent reason. The room was immersed in absolute silence, but there was something wrong. A heavy sensation pressed against my chest. Then I heard it, slow, muffled footsteps, as if someone were walking on the carpet. My heart raced. I looked toward the dark corner and saw a still silhouette just watching me. It didn't blink, it didn't move. I froze, feeling sweat trickle down my neck. That night was only the beginning. Since then, stories like this have haunted me. And now, I will tell you 3 of them. 3 real stories you might prefer not to hear at night. What you are about to hear is not folklore invented to scare children. These are real accounts, lived by ordinary people in ordinary places. Houses, roads, apartments, like yours. I handpicked these stories because they all have something in common. Details that cannot be explained, moments when fear becomes so physical it feels like a cold hand tightening around your throat. As I narrate, close your eyes and try to imagine yourself in their place. Every step, every sound, every shadow getting closer. In the end, you'll understand why sleeping will be a challenge tonight. And to begin, let me tell you how these accounts came to me. For years, I've been collecting stories sent by people who experienced something inexplicable. Some came from relatives, others from close friends, and many arrived as anonymous messages, always carrying an urgent tone, as if the person needed to get rid of that weight. I usually listen, take notes, and keep every detail, not to prove anything, but to remember that sometimes fear has a real address. Today, I've chosen 3 of these stories, and the first begins in an old house where silence hid something far more disturbing. When I moved into that house, I didn't think much about its age. It was old, yes, but it had a strange charm. Tall walls, large windows, and a narrow hallway that led to a room in the back. This room, however, was locked when I arrived. The realtor said it was just for storage, and that the key had been lost years ago. I didn't question it, but from the very first night, I felt that room had something different. The first weeks were peaceful. I worked all day and at night stayed in the living room watching TV or reading. But every now and then, I'd hear a muffled sound coming from the back of the house. It was hard to describe, something between a dragging noise and a faint tapping, as if something touched the wall repeatedly. I thought it was the wind, maybe a loosely closed window, but when I went to check, everything was intact. On the 3rd week, I decided to clean the entire hallway. As I passed in front of the back room, I noticed something that made me stop. The rusty doorknob was slightly turned downward. I didn't remember seeing it like that before. I bent down to look through the keyhole, but saw nothing but darkness. Even so, I had the strange sensation that something moved inside, as if a shadow had passed before the hole. I quickly pulled away, telling myself it was my imagination. That night, I was awakened by a sharp sound, a repetitive, almost rhythmic knock. I got up and followed the sound until I realized it came from the back room. I pressed my ear to the door and heard slow footsteps pacing back and forth. My stomach turned. It was impossible. No one had the key, and all the windows were locked from the inside. I stepped back, trying to convince myself to return to my room, but before I could fully retreat, I heard something worse, a low, prolonged sigh coming from the other side of the door. The next day, I called the realtor demanding explanations. He laughed nervously and said it was probably just the settling with humidity. But before hanging up, I noticed his voice change tone. He asked if I had seen anything. When I said no, he replied, "Better that way," and quickly ended the call. That only made me more suspicious. I decided I needed to get inside that room. I spent the week looking for a master key until, at a flea market, I found an old key ring with dozens of different keys. On Friday night, when the house was steeped in silence, I went to the door. I tried one key, then another, until with a dry click, the lock gave way. The air that came out was heavy, almost damp, and smelled of mold mixed with something metallic, like rusted iron or dried blood. The hallway light barely lit the interior, so I used a flashlight. The walls were peeling, the floor covered in thick dust. In the corner, there was a chair facing the wall, and right beneath it, deep grooves in the floorboards, as if something had been dragged often. When I got closer, I saw something even stranger, a scratch made with a nail or sharp object on the wall, forming lines and numbers I couldn't understand. Sweeping the flashlight across the room, I realized the markings were everywhere, some deeper than others, as if someone had spent a long time here, compulsively scratching the walls. Then I noticed on the floor small footprints, like those of a child, mixed with fresh dust, meaning they were recent. My heart raced. I felt a shiver run up my spine and, instinctively, turned off the flashlight, standing in the dark. That's when I heard a noise behind me, as if something had darted from one corner to another. I turned the light back on, but saw nothing until I looked at the door. It was closed. I hadn't closed it. I ran to it, and to my surprise, the doorknob was ice cold. I twisted it hard, but it wouldn't move. Behind me, slow footsteps began to approach, closer and closer. I couldn't move. I just stood there, feeling something inches away from me. When the door finally opened, I threw myself outside, slamming it shut. I spent the rest of the night locked in my bedroom, too scared to leave. The next day, when I worked up the courage to return to the hallway, I saw that the back room door was locked again, as if it had never been opened. The key I used had disappeared. To this day, I don't know what happened in there. I never tried to open that door again, but sometimes I still hear the sound of footsteps coming from inside. And strangely, whenever that happens, I get the feeling that something or someone is getting closer to my room. And it was precisely because of this experience that I began to pay more attention to the stories that came to me. Some were eerily similar to what I experienced. And the next one, which I heard from a lonely driver, made me believe that certain things don't happen by chance. After what I experienced in that house, I began to listen to and record accounts from people who had also felt fear up close. One of them came from Rodrigo, a truck driver who drove along empty roads during the early hours of the morning. He told me this story with a low voice and his eyes fixed on the floor, as if reliving every second. As he spoke, he seemed unwilling to believe it, but he also knew it hadn't just been his imagination. Rodrigo was heading home after a long delivery. It was almost 2 a.m, and he was driving on a little travel state highway, flanked by brush on both sides. The truck's radio was off, and the only sound was the steady hum of the engine. The sky was clear, but the moon looked smaller, as if it were far too distant. That's when he saw it. About 50 meters ahead, there was a figure standing on the shoulder. At first glance, it looked like a woman, thin, with long hair covering part of her face. She wore a light dress that swayed slightly in the wind. Rodrigo slowed down, thinking she might need help. After all, no one in their right mind would be alone on that road at this hour. As he got closer, he noticed a woman slowly raise her arm, as if asking him to stop. He pulled the truck over a few meters ahead and rolled down the passenger side window. But before saying anything, he noticed something strange. She wasn't moving. The arm remained raised, motionless, and the wind that swayed her dress didn't seem to affect her hair, which stayed plastered to her face. Rodrigo called out, but she didn't respond. Then, with the truck's interior light on, he saw something that made his body go cold. Her skin was far too pale, almost gray, and through the strands of hair, there were no eyes, only 2 dark holes. Panic took over. Without thinking, he shifted into gear and sped away. In the rear-view mirror, he saw the figure lower her arm and begin walking toward the middle of the road. But her movement was wrong. Her steps seemed to glide without kicking up any dust. Rodrigo tried to convince himself it was exhaustion, that he was seeing things from being awake for so many hours. However, a few kilometers later, he noticed something that turned his stomach. In the rear-view mirror, the figure was again on the shoulder, in exactly the same position as before, as if she hadn't moved an inch. He knew it was impossible. There were no intersecting roads there, and he had been driving in a straight line for more than 10 minutes. Speeding up seemed like the only option, but for some reason, the engine began to sputter. The truck lost power, as if something were holding it back. That's when a strange sound filled the cabin, a low whisper coming from inside the truck. Rodrigo quickly glanced at the passenger seat, and for an instant, swore he saw a shadow sitting there. He turned his eyes back to the road, afraid of losing control, and felt an intense cold spread through his body, as if the air had been sucked away. The engine suddenly returned to normal, and he sped to the next town. He pulled into a 24-hour gas station, still shaking. When he got out, the attendant noticed how pale he looked and asked if he was okay. Rodrigo said yes, but when the man looked at the passenger side door, he frowned and asked, "Did you pick up a hitchhiker?" Rodrigo denied it, but the attendant insisted he had seen a woman inside the truck when it arrived. Hearing this, Rodrigo climbed back in to check. The seat was wet, as if someone wearing soaked clothes had just sat there. On the floor were small dark marks, looking like mud mixed with blood. He cleaned everything in a rush and decided never to drive alone on that road at night again. However, weeks later, another truck driver, a friend of his, reported seeing the same figure, standing in the same place. Except in his case, the woman didn't stay by the roadside. She slowly crossed in front of the truck and vanished into thin air. Rodrigo told me that since that night, he completely avoids deserted roads when he's alone. He also said that sometimes, even on busy routes, he feels that same sudden chill and catches, out the corner of his eye, the light dress swaying. But when he turns his head, there's no one there. This account struck me because, like what I experienced in the old house, it involves something that seems to wait for the right person at the right moment, as if these presences had the ability to choose their victims. And it was that similarity that made me remember another story, this time told by a friend who lived alone in an old apartment in the city center. What she went through proves that even surrounded by walls and locks, silence can be far more dangerous than we imagine. I met Laura in a paranormal stories group. She told me something that still makes me question the line between reality and the supernatural. She had just moved into an old apartment in the city center, living alone for the first time. The building was old, with that architecture frozen in time, and she liked the silence around it. But that silence, as she found out, was not normal. In the first night, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Just that absolute quiet that made every internal noise sound like a crash. The street below was alive, but inside the building everything seemed frozen in time, as if the residents were ghosts. Laura noticed she never saw anyone coming or going, nor heard footsteps or voices in the hallways. As days passed, she realized something strange. The building sound seemed to vanish completely as the night went on. There wasn't even the sound of a door closing or a dog barking. It was a heavy, almost suffocating silence. When she tried calling friends or family, her cell phone would sometimes lose signal for long minutes, which was unusual for the area. One Saturday, Laura decided to throw a small party to lift her spirits. She invited a few friends to spend the night to break that oppressive atmosphere. They arrived cheerful, talking and laughing late into the night. But when the clock struck midnight, something changed. The silence returned, and with it came a strange feeling that took over the apartment. The guests began to notice their phones and electronic devices behaving erratically, shutting off and turning on by themselves. The lights flickered, and a cold draft blew, and even though no windows were open, Laura tried to stay calm but felt a weight on her chest, a pressure that seemed to push her toward the floor. When the party ended, everyone left quickly, leaving Laura alone in the apartment. She decided to rest, but had barely closed her eyes when she heard noises coming from the hallway, slow footsteps, as if someone were pacing back and forth. She tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was a neighbor, but the steps stopped right in front of her door. Laura said she stayed still, holding her breath, waiting for the noise to stop. Then came a light touch on the doorknob. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the building had 24-hour security. Desperate, she got up to look through the peephole, but saw nothing. In the following days, the same thing happened. Footsteps, knocks on the door, whispers so faint she couldn't make out the words. She even asked the doorman for help, but no one had seen or heard anything. Some neighbors even avoided contact, as if afraid to talk about the building. The strangest thing, however, was when Laura began finding notes stuck to her door every morning, written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting. They said things like, "Do not make noise after midnight. Silence is the only protection, and listen to what the silence hides. Frightened, she began following the messages, avoiding any loud sounds in the apartment after 12 a.m. But it was exactly at midnight, on one of those nights, that the terror revealed itself uncontrollably. Laura heard a shrill noise, like a door being ripped from its frame. The silence was broken by muffled screams, running footsteps, and the sound of something hitting the floor. She tried to leave her bedroom, but the door seemed jammed by an invisible force. In the next room, a mirror fell by itself, shattering into thousands of shards. Laura's phone began to ring incessantly, but when she answered, there was only silence on the other end. She tried calling the police, but the line was busy. That's when she decided to flee the apartment the next morning, leaving everything behind. To this day, she doesn't know exactly what happened that night. When she returned a few months later, the building was empty and the apartment was sealed off with a sign, "Do not enter." Laura told me that since then, she feels a weight on her chest every time she thinks about that apartment. She avoids absolute silence and prefers the noise of the streets, even if chaotic. What she lived through is a constant reminder that sometimes danger is where we least expect it, hidden in the silence that surrounds us. This story made me think a lot about what being truly safe means. Even behind solid walls and locks, the unknown may just be waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And perhaps what seems like friendly silence is, in fact, the herald of terror. Now, before closing, I want you to reflect. If these stories are real, if these accounts are true, what will be waiting when you turn off the light tonight? Perhaps the answer lies in the next part, where I'll leave you with a thought that will follow you through the night. After hearing these stories, maybe you feel a chill down your spine, a restlessness that won't go away so easily. And it's no wonder, because when such accounts are true, they leave marks that go beyond time and space. Marks that settle in our minds and bodies. Think about the times you felt something strange, that sensation of being watched even when no one is around. Now imagine that for some people, that's not just a feeling. It's a cruel reality that invades their space, without warning and without mercy. Silence can be as powerful an enemy as a terrifying scream. It's in silence that fear grows, that shadows come to life, and that the impossible feels closer than we could ever imagine. These stories, each one, show that fear does not choose time, place, or person. It simply happens. But what do these real experiences teach us? Perhaps that the world is much bigger and more complex than we want to believe. That some things, no matter how hard we try to ignore them, remain there, lurking, waiting, and it's that feeling you should take with you tonight. The one that says darkness may hide more than shadows. That the next time a door closes by itself, a whisper in the dark, or a distant step scares you, it may not just be your imagination. So before you turn off the light and try to sleep, think carefully. Are you really alone? Because if you're not, these stories won't let you sleep tonight. If you made it this far without looking back, congratulations. You're braver than you think. But before you leave, I want you to do one thing. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that will mess with your mind even more. Leave a like to help more people discover these chilling accounts. And of course, tell me in the comments which story affected you the most. Who knows, next time, I might share your own story in the video. Remember, fear only has power if you let it. So, stay alert, keep the lights on, and until the next story, if you dare,